With the amount of time it takes me to make a video, or even get around to the thought of making a video about a specific game, a lot of things can happen. A series can completely pass us by, staying dormant for years, or it can end up having a massive comeback out of nowhere. And today's game is somewhere in the middle, being one I grabbed on PSN a few years ago, but kind of ended up forgetting about after a while, especially with the transition from one console generation to another. There I was, scrolling through my PSN purchase history after getting my hands on a PS5 when... oh yeah, that game. Okay then. And this is where I should add that I don't generally forget about which games I own, at least not with physical ones. I don't know if it's a photographic memory thing or if it's because I'm much more of a visual learner with the way I remember things, but having a physical copy of the game like this is way more memorable than something showing up in my Steam library. Not to make this video into a whole essay about digital versus physically released games or anything like that, but each of these obviously have their pros and cons, depending on what system you're playing the games on and the circumstances of playing them. And across the board, wherever you go, on whatever platform you choose to play on, there's going to be games that have been delisted because of things like licensing agreements, publisher interference, or even the storefront that the game was listed on no longer being functional. Or you could be like Nintendo and delist your own game on your own platform because, I don't know, because it's a Wednesday. But yeah, I don't know, with a physical copy, not only does a game being delisted not affect my ability to play it in the slightest, but I'm just naturally going to end up remembering that I own this thing way more. For me, it's like this. I've got this thing in my hand that I can see and hold, and with it I can admire the box art and put it back on my shelf at any point. Something like this is going to stick in my head way more than some icon on a screen ever could. Anyway, the main reason I bring up all of that is because of the game I want to talk about today, Skylar Plux in Adventure on Clover Island, a game that has pretty much ended up having every single one of the problems I just mentioned. It's a digital-only game that had no physical release that I bought on PSN years ago. Then I kind of forgot about it, and then I moved over to the next console, and now, as of making this video, it's been delisted. Yeah, so I'll go into more detail in regards to this game's disappearing act later on in the video, because thankfully there is some good news there to share, but for now let's just boot this thing up and take a look. Normally at this point I'd be like holding the game and showing it to you, and then I don't know, I'd like film me putting it in the console, but that's not going to happen, so I'll just film a shot of me putting Donkey Kong Country in my Super Nintendo or something. So, first things first, after the main menu, we've got this little cutscene to get started. Skylar, this cat lady, is being held prisoner on board a space station by CRT, this big computer monitor looking guy, and he's looking for some kind of artifact down on the planet below. Skylar has had all of her memories wiped for some reason, and CRT wants to turn her into some kind of super soldier thanks to this crazy robot arm he's fitted onto her. Anyway, before you know it, the robot arm starts talking to Skylar, guiding her to an escape pod which crashes down onto the planet's surface. From here, a small bird named Plux comes by and reluctantly offers to guide her towards the siphon, some big important thing that the robot arm told Skylar to go to. You'll get a few extra tidbits of story while you're playing along, as well as a little bit more towards the very end, but realistically you don't want to go into this expecting too much story is what I'm saying. On the plus side, this just means less focus on a deep narrative and more on getting you on the move and bouncing around within the first minute or so, with this little escape sequence and this nice beach level. And right away, before talking about the controls, I've gotta say, I really like how this game looks. In the best possible way, I would say it looks just like a modernised PS2 game, which isn't an insult coming from someone like me. I feel like I've gotta say that because you kinda see this all the time on the internet these days when a brand new modern game will release, and maybe the way the trees are rendered way off in the background will trigger some graphics-obsessed bozo who types in the comments,
"Oh, what is this, a PS2 game?"
What the hell are you talking about? Of course this isn't a PS2 game, you friggin' dork. This, on the other hand, actually kinda does, but I like how a lot of the PS2 era games looked anyway, especially the ones with a cartoony art style, so yeah, this is great. I do kind of wish the cutscenes were more than just these animatic slideshows though. I mean, the artwork here is really nice, and I totally get that this was a small team making the game, so this was by far the easier option, but I don't know, I just kind of like seeing characters actually doing stuff. Anyway, once you're in the game, I guess if I had to describe what the graphics look like, it's kind of like that more modern, stylized look, like the Spyro Reignited trilogy, Crash Bandicoot 4, or that new KO the Kangaroo game, but this is way less refined, and I'm all about it. It's like a more modern take on Jak and Daxter's cutscene graphics. Not how they looked in Jak 2 and 3, but I mean how they looked in the very first game's cutscenes, with Daxter doing all of those stupid, polygonal, stretchy faces. That is pure PS2 nostalgia for me, and yeah, the graphics in this game are kind of activating that part of my brain, I guess. I don't know, I just think this looks pretty good. I've also got to give a shout out to the music in this game. There's a nice variety of instruments used, and depending on where you are, it really gives me some Banjo-Kazooie vibes. And my favourite track in the entire game from the hub area and the opening beach level is the best example of that Banjo-Kazooie stuff. Not only is it just this really catchy tune that I ended up whistling along to while I was playing anyway, but it also does that thing of having a slightly different version of the track to reflect what areas you're about to go into. Just one thing of note on the presentation side of things though is that by default the audio levels are all over the place for some reason. The opening cutscene nearly blew my damn head off because it was so loud, so I turned the volume down, but then the gameplay is too low, so I turned it back up again just to have a character speak to me and then destroy what remained of my eardrums.
End of the line, kitty cats.
I did do a bit of playing around to make things sound okay in the end, but I ended up keeping the subtitles on, which I don't usually like doing because I kind of like my gameplay to look clean and spoiler free for these videos, but yeah, the dialogue was still either too loud or too quiet pretty much all the time, so what else can I do? But yeah, once the game has properly begun, right away you can play around with most of Skylar's moves, with that opening scene to teach you the basics, and this beach area being your first chance to really just kind of play around with them for a bit. Obviously you've got your basic running and jumping, it wouldn't be much of a platformer without those, although that's not impossible. Anyway, yeah, you've got a double jump, a punch attack, a ground pound, and a spin attack, very much like Jak and Daxter again. In fact, this is pretty much the exact same moveset, except here you can string the punch into 3 hits, and in general I would say Skylar is a little less hefty in her movements. You know, Jak has got that kind of weight and rhythm to the way he runs and jumps around, but Skylar here has a more snappy and deliberate set of movements. If you push that stick or press that button, then that is what she's going to do immediately. To be honest, this is probably just because there's less animation work in general, because you don't get that stretch and squash in the movements here like you would in Jak and Daxter, but the lack of that here just makes everything feel that little bit more responsive. I mean, neither of these is the wrong way to go about it, it's just two sides of the same coin, I guess. Either which way, it's pretty fun having a slightly different take on something I'm already familiar with. You know, you've got the jumping around all over the place and spinning mid-air for a bit of extra height, you know, that kind of thing. But yeah, while Skylar's general movements feel snappy and responsive, I will say her jumps maybe feel a little too heavy to begin with. Not so much on the way up, but on the way back down, she plummets down to Earth. Or whatever planet this takes place on. Rounding out the PS2 platformer inspiration, Skylar can use her robot arm to swing off of these floating hooks, which is, yes, very Ratchet and Clank. But to be fair, like the other movements, I do feel like this is a little different, because here you do retain some of that momentum when you let go, compared to how Ratchet pretty much loses all of his. And yeah, you can also use this to activate certain platforms by pulling them out of the wall, but this only really comes up maybe once or twice, because I don't really remember doing this very often. Yeah, so anybody familiar with this genre, especially with games on the PS2, and especially these games in particular, is going to understand how Skylar Plux works within the first couple of minutes, really. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's trying to rip either of these games off either, because I think Skylar does some of its own stuff, which is pretty cool, and I'll go into that later on in the video. So, structurally speaking, Skylar and Plux adventure on Clover Island is pretty straightforward, but I do like the way it goes about some of these ideas. Once you start the game, you've got this fairly linear path leading to the central hub area of the island, and from here there's 3 gates leading to other areas, being a mountain, a desert, and an industrial factory. Each of these areas is technically 2 or 3 levels stitched together if you count the different environmental themes and teleport pads along the way, but once you go through the loading screen from the hub area into any of those other areas, you can play these out in one continuous sweep without any loading screens, which is really nice because when added together, these areas are friggin' huge. I'm also really liking that the island itself was built to scale, so while you do load in and out of the hub area and the 3 other themed areas, you can still see the entire island as it would have looked if it were a truly open map, which is always such a cool thing to see. I'm always going to think back to the original Jak and Daxter with this, you know, when you can see that floating precursor thing in the background in the opening cutscene, and then you go to the Forbidden Jungle and you actually climb up it? Yeah, that is awesome. I really like this kind of thing because it just lets you see quite literally how far you've come in a very easy to digest kind of way. From all the way up here, you can even see where the escape pod crashed down on the beach. But yeah, in these levels, the main aim of the game is to get to the end and grab the fuse, these big energy ball things that go into the siphon machine in the middle of the hub area. Normally, I would say these are the big important collectibles that you have to go after, but it doesn't really feel like you're collecting them, to be honest. Once you find one of these things, you are instantly placed back into the hub area to put them where they belong, so these feel a lot more like those teleport pads at the end of a Crash Bandicoot level than anything else. None of that really matters though, because I'd say the real alternative to your stars, jiggies, orbs, crystals, power cells, floating clocks, dragon eggs, dreamer orbs, you know, that kind of thing, are these little cages that you have to bust open to free the island's inhabitants, which, yeah, I guess I'll just add Rayman to the pile of inspiration games for this one. Thankfully, these are a little bit more involved than just smashing them open though, because each one is locked, and you'll have to fork over 100 gems to get it open, which gives you reason enough to collect as many of those things as you can. The only big problem I have with the cages is how the HUD keeps track of which ones you've opened, because while I said each area of the island is technically split into 2 or 3 levels, because you get this little text box pop up to tell you when you've entered one of them, it's as if this counter in the corner doesn't understand that, and instead it shows you how many you have to collect on the entire part of the island that you're on, which is, well, I mean, these are huge, and I've only got 1 left to collect in this area, so I'm pretty sure I'm not going to find that in a hurry. But at least when it comes to actually opening the cages, I didn't really have any issues. There's always enough of these red gems around to afford the cage unlocks, and to be honest, I found them pretty fun to collect anyway, as they're nice and shiny, they make a pleasant sound when you grab them, they're scattered all over the place, and you get a bunch of them for busting open crates. But in the mountain level in particular, there's loads of them hidden inside these ceramic pots that you can find on parts of the mountain that you would think you weren't supposed to be able to get to, but you can. Yeah, so this is one of those games where the playable area is more like whatever you can see and whatever you can reach. So if you do a bunch of mid-air jump, Tony Hawk trick shot bullshit, you can get to parts of the mountain that are way off the beaten path. But there are certain areas where I guess the dev team just slapped a bunch of these pots around to make it seem more like it was actually worth doing this. It is a bit of a shame really, because I kind of wish there were even more collectibles hidden around in some of these areas, because they were fun to try and reach, even if there is literally nothing up here. It's just pretty fun to see how much of this area you can actually get to if you brute force it. It's like playing an Elder Scrolls game, you know, when you're trying to get up the mountain and you just keep pressing the jump button, get up there. Get up there. But yeah, there is a bit of a collectible hierarchy in place here, which is always a good thing. You gotta grab those gems to open the cages, and then you gotta open those cages to get given extra heart containers for your health meter, which is obviously gonna make your life a little easier when there's lots of enemies around. So yeah, everything you can collect is worth collecting, because it all kind of feeds into itself. It's good. Along the way, you'll get a little bit of extra story through bits of dialogue here and there, but I don't know, none of it's really anything to write home about. Plux keeps talking about how he's been abandoned by his father, which gets kind of old and forgotten about pretty quickly, and CRT keeps coming up to mock the good guys with his banter, but then also occasionally just kind of pops up to generally talk to them, like just a normal conversation. I think what they were going for here was something like Handsome Jack from Borderlands 2, where the bad guy is supposed to be kind of funny and kind of charming, but also a massive dickhead at the same time. But I don't know, it kind of feels like they missed the mark here if that's what they were going for. The voice acting overall is also a bit it's not the best, especially with Plux just going on and on and on. It probably would have helped if Skylar ever spoke back for a bit of back and forth banter between the two characters, but she never does. And some of the things Plux is saying does kind of justify some sort of response, but yeah, we never get one. I mean, she's had all of her memories wiped at the start of the game, so maybe she forgets how to speak. I don't know. Anyway, going back to the levels, the other thing worth mentioning about these areas are the new gadgets that you unlock along the way for some level-specific gimmicks and some general movement extensions. Again, it's very, that. In the mountain area, you'll unlock a jetpack, in the desert, you'll unlock some kind of time manipulation bubble, and in the industrial area, you'll unlock a big magnet. Instead of talking about these in the order you get them, I'm going to go into detail for each one in order of how interesting I think they are, starting out from the bottom with the time gizmo thing, which, yeah, this lets you slow down time to get by these spinning platforms, which is okay, but again, I feel like that's kind of been done before. And this was pretty useful for jumping into a horde of smaller enemies, because then you can just go wild with punches and deal with them a little easier that way. And I guess the most interesting thing this does is for these little puzzle sections where you'll need to create a time bubble to reveal the past version of an object and then move things around before reverting it back to normal again. Again, this is something I feel like I've seen done in other games, and the way it's presented here is pretty basic, but it is easy enough to understand and it gets the job done, so yeah, it's there and it's fine. After that, there's the magnet. This one lets you grab onto things and chuck them around as long as they're made of metal, so you can pick up these little robot bad guys and throw them all over the place, as well as grab onto certain patches of machinery on the ceiling for a lift and activate these little floating platforms, which I think give off a nice visual effect. And while all of that is kind of predictable given this is just a big magnet, I've got to admit it was pretty cool to use this thing to pick up the machine gun robots, which then means you have a machine gun. But yeah, the main reason you'll have the magnet on hand is so you can chuck this big ball around the level, which is alright, I guess, but again, I've kind of played other games where you do this, and even in those games, it was okay, I guess. It's nothing much to shout about. But by far, the most interesting and fun one to play around with for me is the jetpack. And this thing is kind of deceptive. You'll get this, and at first, it's just a way of doing a little glide, a boost jump, and a long jump, but this ended up being my favourite thing in the entire game to just generally mess around with and see how far I could push the game with it, because this thing almost feels broken, but in a good way. So first of all, the roll jump that this thing lets you do is pretty fun on its own anyway. The jetpack lets off this satisfying explosive sound effect which launches Skylar across the screen with her fist facing forwards, and the resulting jump is again a little heavy at first, but it is always consistent, so you can be pretty accurate with it once you get used to how it feels. But the best thing about this jetpack is how it lets you keep momentum from previous movements, so if you enter a glide after swinging from a hook shot, that'll send you pretty far. Or in this area where there's bouncy mushrooms everywhere, yeah, you can bounce around on them like normal if you want, or you could roll jump into one of them and then bounce off of it to keep that momentum, and then you can enter a glide to go even further, and it just feels awesome. I think the developers realized this was a fun idea because there is this one single cage in the entire game that is locked behind that exact movement pattern, but it only happens the one time, so maybe they weren't confident in the idea, or maybe they only realized you could do it after it was being play tested or something. I don't really know, that's pure speculation on my part, but yeah, it's good, whatever it is. Either which way, I love the jetpack. It is a lot of fun to play around with, especially if you go climbing up that mountain with it. Although, it is kind of weird that there is even a jetpack here at all, in a way, because, I mean, you've got these two cartoony platformer characters, one of them being a bird, and you never use him or his natural bird-like abilities for anything, which seems a little off and a bit of a wasted opportunity. It doesn't have to be much, but you know, maybe you could use him to hover around like in Banjo-Kazooie or Yooka-Laylee, or how you could fire the Scarecrow at switches and enemies in Pumpkin Jack. You know, just use him for something. Instead, throughout the entire game, Plux will just follow you around and spout words of encouragement or make general comments on the environment, but he's never actually doing anything, which is a bit of a shame really. I just kind of wish the guy did something, you know? Anyway, this is the part of the video where I'm going to be talking about the entire ending, which would normally be labelled as a spoiler, but like I've said about 6 million times throughout this video, the game has been delisted, so I don't think anybody's really going to care, and if for some reason you do, then don't. I'm not going to be talking about it for very long, because there's not much here. Yeah, so once you collect the 3 orb things from each of the 3 areas on the island, you'll then be able to teleport back to the spaceship that Skylar escaped from at the beginning of the game and take on CRT in a one-on-one fight. And the boss fight itself isn't too bad actually, with you having to react quickly to well-telegraphed attacks and use the magnet to chuck things back at him in order to get a few punches in. After that, the game quickly ends, with CRT turning out to be a hamster in disguise.
Oh my god.
Anyway, after the fight, everybody just kinda hugs it out, becomes friends, and calls it a day. And that's it. Back to the main menu. Yeah, I did say not to go into this expecting much of a story after all. But yeah, it definitely has its rough edges with the voice acting, story and animations being a little janky. But actually playing through each of these levels and seeing how they're laid out, with them twisting and curving around themselves in order to lead you in the right direction, with those controls actually being really nice once you get a feel for them, I'd say this game's actually kind of good. Plus you've got the music and the visuals, which are totally my kind of thing, and while that's completely subjective, I don't know, I think it's worth dishing out a couple of extra points for, why not? But from here, this is where the story of this game gets a little rocky, both in terms of the game itself and what eventually happened to it. To start off with, I'll talk about the game's length, with it coming in at around 2 hours-ish if you're playing through it casually like I was. The thing is, I wasn't rushing through the game, and I spent a good amount of time trying to find extra cages and just generally dicking around with the jetpack trying to climb up parts of the mountain I wasn't supposed to go to. But yeah, finishing the game and seeing that playtime is kinda sad, because honestly this feels like the opening chapter to a much bigger game. I mean, that boss fight I spoke about earlier on, that's the only one. You'll get those 3 areas of the island and a boss fight to do, and then you're done. What we do have here was pretty fun though, and it functions just fine. I mean, there are a few glitches here and there, but nothing game breaking. Probably the biggest glitch in this game wasn't even that big of an inconvenience to me, where the final credits started rolling after the final cutscene decided to play at super speed and without any sound. So in order to remedy that, I had to go back and beat the final boss again, which took all of 2 minutes, so, you know, whatever, it's fine, not a big deal. But yeah, it just feels like this game has been cut short, unfortunately. I mean, the story alone just ends really abruptly, and in terms of the gameplay, I just feel like there's quite a lot of potential here. So yeah, this would normally be the part of the video where I'd say the pros outweigh the cons, and that if it's on sale, I'd check it out, but that's the thing, it's not on sale. At all. It's just gone. Yeah, so while I've mentioned the delisting a few times so far, when I did actually sit down to start playing this game with the intention of turning it into this video, I had no idea about any of that. This was all stuff I just stumbled across after I'd beaten the game and started looking around for some information about it, and why I never hear anybody talk about it anymore. It all started pretty much right after I finished the game, when I thought to myself, you know what, I'm gonna buy this again on Steam just to be a good sport. And that's when I spotted this little message. Huh, okay. So then I had a look for it on the Xbox storefront, and there's no sign of it there either. And while I obviously have access to it on my PlayStation thanks to my purchase history, if I do a search on the actual PSN store, same again, it's just gone. I've got another game on my PlayStation here called Dead Core, which was also put onto consoles by the same publisher, which has also been delisted from PlayStation and Xbox storefronts. But it is still around on the PC thanks to a different publisher, so maybe it was something to do with that. but I did want to know exactly what went down there, and while I could just sit here and leave it at that or just generally speculate, I figured I'd try and reach out to the developers themselves at Right Nice Games, and yeah, Dennis here got back to me, so everything I say from this point on regarding the delisting is information I've had straight from the source. It turns out the whole removal was indeed a decision made by Grip Digital and nothing to do with Right Nice Games themselves. The team were obviously really sad that their game that they'd worked really hard on got taken down, but not only that, it gets worse because they weren't even made aware of the takedown at all, and it was only through fans of the game reaching out to them that they found out that the delisting had even happened. From that point on, there were emails sent to Grip Digital that went without response for weeks for seemingly no reason, until it was eventually passed on that Grip Digital had decided they weren't going to publish games anymore, which affected most of the games they had published up until that point, including this one. So yeah, that's why this game isn't available anymore. But in terms of its longevity, Skylar Plux released in 2017, but it was then delisted in 2021, meaning the game was only available for around 4 years or so, which kinda sucks. Farewell, my friend. We drop an F in the chat for the blue kitty cat. Thankfully though, that isn't the end of this story. At the moment, the team is currently working on a party game called Right Nice Party, which has a trailer and looks nice enough, but alongside that, they also have some kind of reboot or reimagining of their platformer game in the works. Dennis understandably didn't give me many details about this because it's still very early days for the project, but there are a few bits and pieces of concept art and information out there on Twitter to see, which, yeah, I'll definitely be keeping my eye on this. So maybe the adventure on Clover Island really was just the opening chapter to a much bigger game after all. Who knows? I'm looking forward to finding out though, that's for sure. So yeah, I guess that is Skylar and Plux in Adventure on Clover Island. I'm not gonna lie, it's kind of weird getting to the end of one of these videos and standing here, despite playing a game I genuinely enjoyed, I can't recommend anybody actually play because it's not available anymore. I'm pretty sure that's a first for the channel, so yeah, at the very least, I hope I've shown you something new and made you aware of what's possibly to come from all of this in the future. Yo, thanks for watching my video. I'm pretty sure nobody asked for a video on this game, but this is what I felt like talking about, so what are you gonna do? I also ended up delaying this video by a few weeks because of that new camera and lighting setup, but I think it was worth it. I think it looks pretty good, so yeah, that's all I got. Bye!